pleasure to introduce several speakers here today. Really, with all the questions we're all getting about the CARES Act, uh, the various labor things affecting agriculture, the various policies there, all the way from all of our farms and ranches and dairies to many of our allied industries and businesses involved there. So our attempt here today is to get some more information out. If you're having trouble digging through the rules, uh, figuring out where to go next, how these various proposals and the ones coming down the road may affect all of us across agriculture. That's our attempt here today. It's my pleasure. I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers. We've got three really great ones from across the southern region. And I should also say too, we do this based on, as a group across the South, we have a Southern Extension group that works together and cooperatively across all kinds of issues facing agriculture. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce all three of these guys now, and then we can, they'll roll right through their slides and discussion, and we certainly you'll be seeing some questions from some of us in the audience as well. So we've got three speakers: Derek Farnsworth from University of Florida on labor issues, J.C. Hobbs from Oklahoma State University Extension, and Adam Kantrovich from Clemson University. All of us are extension economists and work in these areas of the CARES Act, business, taxes, and labor issues. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers today. Take it away.
David, thank you for the introduction. As he said, I'm Derek Farnsworth from the University of Florida, and I'm going to kick us off for today, formally with the presentation. The discussion topics we're going to be covering are we're going to start with a labor update and some challenges specifically with the H-2A program. I'll be covering that. And then we'll start getting in earnest into the COVID-19 related legislation. So we've got a few acts there. We've got the, actually the first act, which we won't go into too much depth on, is the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. But we'll spend more time talking about the Families First Act. I guess the longer name for that would be the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And we'll spend quite a bit of time with the Third Wave Act at the end of this previous month, Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, the CARES Act. And we'll have a number of important programs to talk about under these categories. We'll talk about paid sick leave and family leave pretty extensively with the Families First Act, and we'll be talking about things like PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, emergency injury, disaster loans, and perhaps if we have some time at the end, the economic impact payments with the CARES Act. So you'll notice that we are posting these slides as well. So not only do we have the recording, but you should be able to see these slides on the website too. So we have our contact information if you need to reach out to us individually. And we've also got a fair number of resources posted at the end of this presentation, which we may feel the need to update as time goes by. It's a very evolving situation. So the classic disclaimer, we're doing our best here to keep up with things, but it's a very fast moving situation with this new COVID legislation and some of the labor issues that are arising. So keep in mind that this isn't formal tax or legal advice. We're doing our best here to help you out, but there's also potential for changes to occur in the future or us to perhaps misinterpret something that hasn't quite been clarified yet. So just a quick overview of the COVID legislation before we jump formally into the labor part of this presentation. We've got the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Act, a Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, which just came out at the beginning of this month. It's kind of the first wave of the three waves of acts. This also is the smallest funding allocation of the three acts, with only 8.3, it feels weird saying only 8.3 billion, but only 8.3 billion allocated for treatment and prevention of the coronavirus, primarily with domestic funding, but there's some international funding for that as well. And we have a variety of emergency small business loan subsidies out there, particularly 20 million for the Small Business Administration emergency loans. We've got the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, Family First Act, as we'll refer to it from here on out. which was passed on March 18th and will be effective hopefully April 1st. Well, already April 1st, and that's got a minimum of 192 billion allocated towards a variety of different programs. With primarily we'll be discussing the paid sick leave and family leave associated with the Families First Act. In this presentation, there'll be of particular interest to ag producers and related industries. And then finally, we've got the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, the CARES Act, which was passed on the 27th and should be effective as soon as possible, with over 2 trillion in stimulus through loans and various other programs. Like we said, the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, the Emergency Injury Disaster Loans, and the Economic Impact Payments, along with other various funding allocations. So with that kind of brief overview, and JC and Adam will get into that later in more detail. Before we really get into a lot of depth on those specific programs, I'd just like to speak briefly on some of the challenges we've seen with agricultural labor arising due to these issues with COVID-19. So some of these general challenges, H-2A, this is a guest worker program for ag workers in the U.S., where we primarily have seasonal temporary workers here for less than 1 year, mostly from Mexico, to work in ag. H-2A is for ag, and H-2B, for example, would be for non-ag workers on temporary visas. Typically, this program is quite large in agriculture, with over 200,000 seasonal ag workers per year. We were probably expecting around 240 to 260,000 ag workers this year through the program. And so there's a lot of travel and use of consulates and embassies to facilitate that program. And so with the recent stopping of routine services by these embassies and consulates, there are some concerns about whether we'll be able to get those workers here. Note that farm workers are considered essential. So when we talk about the visa issues a little bit more, just to kind of get ahead myself a bit, those essential farm workers, those essential H-2A workers are still working, and those consulates are actually still processing those visas. Other travel restrictions and health concerns may potentially slow the incoming H-2A workers though, so we'll talk about that a bit more too. Some employees or employers have been worried about meeting their 3/4 guarantee. A little bit of clarification about that, each H-2A worker, temporary guest worker, is here on a contract with a number of hours specified in that contract. The employers, as part of that contract, are required to fulfill at least 75% of those promised hours, unless there's a quote unquote, act of God or some emergency situation. So it's been a major concern, especially for operators who have a falling demand for their product, depending on these different marketing issues that have arisen lately, whether they'll be able to meet that guarantee. And just once again, to kind of get ahead of myself a bit, that guarantee has been relaxed. This is considered an emergency situation. And so that won't be as big of a concern, hopefully. Another major challenge that people have been worried about is the paid work leave requirement as part of the Families First Act. So, once again, to kind of prelude things in the future, the Families First Act wants people to be taking sick leave or family leave if necessary to prevent the spread of the disease or handle maybe situations that are coming up at home. And so that may also have effects on the H-2A program. H-2A workers do qualify for that paid work leave. And so that may have some effects with regard to the supply of ag labor. There's increasing housing and work safety concerns. So of course, a lot of employers are going to be implementing or already have implemented social distancing measures, especially with regard to housing. This can be an issue because there's a long approval process, or not necessarily long, but a careful approval process for getting that housing approved to OSHA standards and everything else. And so there are some concerns about whether moving workers to other housing is going to be viable. And the Department of Labor has issued some clarifications on that. And then finally, kind of a general challenge of This goes back to more or less the root of the H-2A program, but these temporary guest workers, typically from Mexico, but also from other countries, are not intended to replace domestic workers in agriculture. And so there are a variety of measures to prevent that from happening, from the adverse effect wage rate, which is sort of the minimum wage for H-2A workers, but also there are provisions in the legislation that domestic workers must receive preference over these H-2A temporary workers, foreign workers. And so there has been anecdotal observations of state workforce agencies considering or denying requests for workers because the recent rise in unemployment and them wanting those unemployed U.S. residents to take the job instead of a foreign worker. So we haven't heard anything widespread yet, but there's been a little bit of murmuring and anecdotal evidence of that so far. And so that's something we might want to keep an eye on moving forward. So more on the topic of worker visas, H-2A, like I said before, H-2A visa applications are being processed by consulates despite the halt of routine services. So routine processing is stopped and generally travel is slowing down between Mexico and the US, but H-2A is considered essential and high priority for US economic prosperity. And so we are prioritizing, recently Secretary Pompeo and Perdue have discussed this. We are prioritizing the H-2A visa applications at the consulates. In the past, what has been the standard is that returning workers within 12 months may be processed without an interview. So some places would perhaps require an interview, some wouldn't necessarily do that. Given the recent situation, Secretary Pompeo announced that with the support of the Department of Homeland Security as well, that they would be extending interview waivers for all first-time applicants and visas that have expired within 48 months. So essentially, if you're not already raising a red flag, it's a lot easier to get an interview waiver, which reduces that personal contact and facilitates the process overall. So that should reduce some of the burden on these consulates for visa processing. Further, the USDA and Department of Labor are facilitating worker transfers on expiring contracts. And so we can actually provide a link to that website probably at the end of this presentation or separately. But essentially, these contracts are supposed to be less than a year, seasonal temporary workers, remember. And so instead of maybe having them go back to Mexico immediately or wherever they came from, whichever country it may have been, the USDA and Department of Labor are going to try to facilitate the process of just getting them to move to another operation and work there without being required to return home first. And this is new. Like I said before, kind of when I was giving the disclaimer, things are constantly changing and updates are constantly occurring. And so really pay attention to the date of this presentation because tomorrow some of these notes may be out of date. But just as of yesterday, we had an announcement that the 3-year maximum stay for H-2A workers is extended temporarily. So on a year-to-year basis, they can only stay for less than a year and then return to their home country. But there was a maximum of 3 consecutive years, and that's also been relaxed. And so you can kind of see the point of all this legislation, or not necessarily legislation, but these announcements and changes to policy is essentially to reduce social contact whenever necessary and to allow workers to stay a little bit longer to perhaps fill that gap in worker availability in the near future. There are also some housing and work safety concerns that have been coming up. So potentially the close contact nature of farm work, people working in crews or sharing housing accommodations could facilitate the spread of the coronavirus. And so many employers have been implementing social distancing measures. This isn't exactly free. There are various costs associated with this, especially housing, where you might have to put someone into a different house, and that's additional rent, and those type of costs can add up. And for different work crews, they may be trying to spread out the workers in various ways, or even providing additional safety equipment. So that can all be potentially costly, and we have heard evidence of people doing that already. To support those efforts, the Department of Labor is relaxing some of its regulations, not regarding worker safety, but basically the contracts administered through the Department of Labor for these H-2A workers are very particular about the duties and work sites a worker is assigned to. So if a work site is not listed on the H-2A request, or a duty is not listed on that H-2A worker request, or that contract, normally it would not be permitted for the worker to work at a different non-listed work site or non-listed duty. That would not be allowed. In the past, it's been pretty strictly enforced, whereas now, given the emergency nature of the situation, the Department of Labor has relaxed some of those regulations and are now permitting workers to perform limited duties outside of the original job order. And they're also allowing work on other work sites outside of the original job order. And so once again, you're going to need the paperwork and the evidence for why this was necessary. It's probably pretty clear given the ongoing situation. If you're implementing some social distancing measures, you may have to have a worker perform a duty not with their normal crew. And so if you can justify that and document it, it shouldn't be an issue. The Department of Labor understands what's going on with the world right now. And same thing with having your workers potentially either transfer before their contract is over, or work another work site, or after their contract is over, still transfer before returning to their home country. Those type of things the Department of Labor is becoming a little bit less strict about, as long as you can identify that it's a part of this emergency situation and provide documentation in hindsight. Similarly, like I said before, it's probably a good idea to give these workers a little bit of additional space, social distance in their housing facilities as well. And so that may mean on occasion acquiring additional housing to spread out the workers essentially. And there is a pretty a certain approval process for housing inspections that's still required by the Department of Labor for these workers, but currently it's been relaxed in such a way that you can move these workers to housing that has not been yet inspected and certified, as long as you are as quickly as possible acting to get that housing inspected and certified. So it's still required eventually that the housing be inspected and certified, but because of the emergency nature of the situation, in the short term, if you need to do it, you can move people in the short term. So once again, you're eventually going to need that documentation, and take note of everything you're doing and why to cover your butt, as you may say. But there are a variety of regulations that are being relaxed given the ongoing COVID-19 situation. And maybe one final note about the housing. Some of these housing inspections are moving to, as opposed to physical in-person inspections, moving virtual. So just keep that in mind. And if offices do close down and virtual inspections are no longer possible, then they've stated the goal to relax that inspection requirement until it's possible to do so. So that covers most of the main issues with H-2A. I'll open it up really quickly for questions, but we're about to transition to the major COVID-19 legislation and go really into depth on that. And Dr. Kancevich and Mr. Hobbs will be handling that discussion. But before we move on, are there any brief questions about H-2A and that ongoing situation with these guest workers?
Derek, this is Jordan Shockley. You mentioned H-2A workers qualify under the Family First Act, but do H-2A workers qualify for PPP? And is there any repercussions if H-2A workers were claimed and are not supported?
Well, I'll give you a brief answer to this, but Dr. Kancevich will, I'm sure, will clarify later. But essentially, can you include H-2A in PPP filing? The formal response to that is payroll does not include compensation for those whose principal residence is outside the U.S. So if you're a very risk-averse agribusiness operator, employer of H-2A workers, you may not include them in the filing, but there hasn't been a final clarification on this issue yet, and you can see why this would be potentially a contentious issue. So there's no, I wouldn't say there's a final word yet, but if you're kind of risk averse, you may not include them. But if you do include them in your filing, be ready to pay back that money immediately depending on the final clarification. So I do know Dr. Kantrovich will address this issue in greater detail later, but that's kind of the short version of that answer, I believe.
Thank you.
All right. I'm Adam Kantrovich with Clemson University, so I'm going to talk about a couple of the other pieces of legislation and its effects on our farms and ranches. We're going to start off with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, also being shortened to the Families First Act. And the Families First Act, there's a couple of pieces that are very specific that are going to affect a number of our farms and ranches or potentially affect them. And so that's what we're going to cover as part of this act. And it provides employers of specified size to cover the cost of employee leave due to COVID-19. So what may affect the farms and ranches? Potentially the paid sick leave, paid family leave, and notice requirements. This includes all businesses with 500 or less employees. And the trick to this is whether or not this is going to affect me as a producer may change throughout my season, because when somebody comes and requests leave, it is at the time of the request that you have to do an employee count to determine whether or not you have to follow portions of this act. There are no exceptions, and this includes as it relates to H-2A and H-2B and seasonal employees. And this will cover any potential leave that is COVID-19 related between April 1 of 2020 and 12/31 of 2020. However, if the business or farm shuts down or furloughs any individuals because of COVID, then I may not have to follow or cover the cost of paid sick leave or paid family leave during those furloughed or during the time the business has shut down. So the paid sick leave portion of COVID related to COVID-19 as part of the Families First Act essentially says that if you are a business with less than 500 employees, you are now required to cover 2 weeks worth of sick leave or the equivalency of 80 hours if the worker is quarantined by a doctor or local government, if the individual has COVID-19 symptoms and is seeking medical diagnosis and is awaiting a COVID-19 diagnosis. And as you are paying this individual, it maxes out on a per person per day of $511 and a maximum for that 2 week period of time. And you'll notice if you do the multiplication, that is for 10 days period of $5,110 per person over that period of time. Now that is the short term. Then we have the longer piece, which is made up of two different sections, a 2 week piece and then a 10 week piece. And this is what most of us are referring to as the family leave piece, which would be more similar to the FMLA that has been expanded to be able to cover COVID-related issues. So the first portion of 2 weeks could be paid at 2/3 of the regular rate of pay, again, 80 hours, maximum per person of $200 a day, or $2,000 total maximum per person over the 2 week period. And this can be taken if the worker is required to care for an individual under quarantine. Now, that individual does not have to be a family member, so they could be caring for a neighbor during this time, okay? Or to care for a child under the age of 18 because that child's childcare or school has closed. Then under the expanded family and medical leave portion, which is the 10-week piece, that has a maximum per person of $10,000 over that 10 weeks. Again, that equates to, if you do the math, $200 maximum per person per day. And that's only if their wage, all right, it allows that. So it may be less than that. The employee, to be eligible for this, must have been on the payroll for at least 30 days and up to an addition, and this allows up to an additional 10 weeks to care for a son or daughter under the age of 18 whose school or daycare has closed. So it is very specific for the reasons that you have to approve this. Now, although under this larger family leave piece, 12 weeks total is possible. So an individual can take 2 weeks to care for an individual and then the 10 weeks of long-term family leave for that total 12-week piece. What do you do for part-time individuals that may fall ill, especially given the amount of time that they've been there? So this is how you begin to apply how I have to pay an individual or the amount of total hours expected that I have to cover for sick leave. Leave is to be based on the employee's average number of hours over a 2-week period of time. But we sometimes, especially on farms, may have an individual that is part-time and their hours are variable. It's not a set time that they are working 20 hours a week every week. It might be 5 hours one week, 15 hours another. And so if we do have an individual that works variable hours, what you need to do is take their 6 month period prior to this, okay, and come up with an average over that period of time, a weekly average, to determine the daily hours that you have to provide or cover for that individual. If the employee has been working for less than 6 months, then what you need to do is use the agreed upon expected schedule of hours at the time of hire. Now, the rate of pay, it does not include anything over 40 hours a week. It does not include any overtime. It does not include any bonuses, tips, etc. So you are going to take a look at the base wage that is typically used prior to anything else that would be added on top of that wage. The regular Family Medical Leave Act will follow the, lack of a better term, the norm for anything outside of COVID-related issues, okay? So the Families First Act only makes changes and requirements as it relates to the specified COVID-19 related events, such as school closings or somebody that now has to be self-quarantined or care for somebody due to those COVID-related issues. That is it. Now, the other thing that you have to be very aware of is that there are some states that have instituted their own regulations as it relates to COVID, or that, and so those would automatically supersede the Families First Act's legislation and regulations. And there are states that have additional requirements that also preempt because they are more strict than the general FMLA. And so if you are in one of those states, you need to be aware of that, and those may supersede Families First or federal legislation as it relates to FMLA. And as normal, you cannot fire a worker for using the leave or making a complaint. Now, some people may have heard that there might be exclusions for employers that have less than 50 or fewer than 50 employees. We have to be very careful about discussing or trying to automatically assume that there is a blanket exclusion from having to utilize the legislation under Families First for that, because it is very, very specific. And so here's what this means. So employers that do have fewer than 50 employees, they may be exempt from very specific pieces, but only under very specific circumstances, okay? And it is only going to be dealing with the closed school long-term family leave requirement. And it is only if we can meet the following. One, providing the leave will cause the employer's expenses to exceed the employer's revenues and possibly requiring the business to close. Or the loss of workers will create a substantial risk to the financial health or the operational capabilities of the business. And third, that the worker is needed for the business to maintain minimal capacity for operations to continue because there are not enough workers that are able, willing, or qualified to cover the worker requesting the leave. That is it. That is your circle right there, the confinement or constraints that you have that potentially can exclude you from that one small piece of the legislation, okay? Employers with fewer than 50 employees, even if I'm able to meet those exclusion, you are still required to comply with all other parts of the law and legislation. So let's understand what this means, because much of the complaints are, well, I never had sick leave, paid sick leave, or long-term leave. Now I have an extra expense that I have to make up as an employer. So how does this work? Well, the employer is going to have to cover this cost initially. Now, the reality is how the employer is going to be reimbursed for this is going to be dependent, because I have a couple of options that are available to me to help cover these costs. And if you choose one, it's going to affect the other. So let's start off with how the Families First has set this up. And technically what it has set up is the availability of an advance on a refundable tax credit. So when I have to begin to pay for an employee or employees that are making use of this, that I now have to cover the cost, either the full cost for the 2-week sick leave, the shorter term piece, or the longer term piece at 2/3 rate of pay, what ends up happening is the normal pool of funds that I am using to cover the employer share of FICA that I have to then put into a pot that goes to the feds, I will begin to remove dollar for dollar from that pot to cover the expenses that I have to cover the sick leave or the family leave. Now, if there is not enough money in that pot to be able to cover those costs, I can take an additional advance on a refundable tax credit, and in long term, there are some limits. I can file a form IRS 7200, fax it, or get it to the IRS, and supposedly the IRS will have a 1 to 2 week turnaround period, is what they are stating, in paying you the advance on the additional amount of the refundable tax credit. Now, here's the piece we have to remember. If I am going to pull money out to cover those costs from FICA and use the IRS 7200 method, I may be ineligible to make use of the Paycheck Protection Program, which we're going to talk about in a little while. The notification. Now, the Department of Labor has a series of posters, and we have a link on one of our resource slides at the end of the slide deck that will take you there, that is already developed. And the employer is responsible for providing notice of an employee's rights under the Families First Act. Signs have to be placed in visible locations, just like many other notification requirements from other agencies and DOL, etc. And it has to be in the language of the employees. And so the DOL has these signs already made up in Spanish, in English, I believe in Chinese, and a number of other languages. Now, for those of you that might have employees that are telecommuting or working from home, you may email the notification to them. You need to make sure that they have seen it And so you are allowed to do that. So the next big piece that is being discussed is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or what's known as the CARES Act. Over $2 trillion of economic stimulus that has been developed and passed to address the economic fallout of COVID-19. And it is the largest one at the time that it was signed in U.S. history. Now, this slide just simply shows you how different funds within the act is being allocated, because the bulk of what you're hearing through the news media has been focusing on the small business loans through SBA. We're going to talk about two pieces of that specifically. You hear about the household payments, such as the employee impact payment or the economic impact payment. If I'm not able to discuss that today, I will leave it in the slide deck so that everybody can read those. And so this is how this is being allocated, but you never really hear about in the media the airlines loans and airlines and cargo grants, public transit, aids to state and municipalities, and a number of other things that's taken place, along with tax deferrals and deadline extensions for taxes. I do have some links in the resources to some articles that I've developed that talks about a few of those other pieces. This is another slide that also addresses these issues and gets into a little bit more of the details on how a lot of this is being allocated. So let's talk about some of the specifics with the CARES Act ag-related provisions. $9.5 billion was sent to the USDA to be able to be utilized within the legislation itself. It specifically talks about specialty crop growers, livestock producers, and dairy farmers. We have yet to know the specifics on how this is going to work. I did see that through various reports today, we are expecting some information to come out today, and unnamed sources, as it were, reports that there may be some direct payments involved, along with some other possible methods of distribution. The $14 billion that went to the commodity credit corporations, we are unsure exactly what that's going to look like. There are expectations that it's going to be MFP-like, if not a continuance of the MFP itself. However, we have heard that the CCC funds will most likely not be utilized until later this summer, possibly July. $349 billion was provided to through the Small Business Association. And that pot of money has already been utilized, and we will talk more about that at the end of today's discussion. And we'll talk more in depth on the PPP loan and the EIDL loan here shortly, and those are the biggest programs that 349 is going through. $15.8 billion going to SNAP, 8.8 for child nutrition program, $100 million to reconnect grants to expand access to broadband, another $55 million for inspections and protections to continue to help prevent invasive pests and animal diseases, and another $33 million for food safety inspectors and meat processing plants. So again, the USDA and CCC funds that were provided or appropriated through the CARES Act, we are expecting USDA to announce very shortly, and it could be today or tomorrow, if not early next week, and how these funds are going to be disseminated. So the SBA programs that we're going to discuss, one is what sometimes we've been hearing, Section 7A, and really the CARES Act made changes to SBA Section 7A to be able to allow agriculture to be eligible, and this also includes some small ag co-ops, and then has provided funds for the SBA Section 7B, which is the Emergency Injury Disaster Loan, also known as EIDL. It was from what we're hearing, there was intention for the expansion to allow all of agriculture. However, right now, agriculture is not eligible except for certain carve-outs that were previously allowed, which does include greenhouses. Mr. J.C. Hobbs will be discussing the specifics of the EIDL loans later on within the presentation. So let's start talking about the Paycheck Protection Program, also known as or being discussed as or talked about as PPP. So the basics of the PPP: farms and ranches are in fact eligible. Businesses must have been in operation on February 15th, 2020. This does include self-employed and independent contractors. Now, what we have, although the operation has to have been around prior to February 15th, through guidance that was provided 72 hours previous to us recording this, for the eligibility and the determination in the loan amount, it specifically says how you determine that loan amount, and it is going to be based on the 2019 taxes. And so that's very important, because in reality what that means is you have to been around prior to January 1st of 2020 if you're going to have 2019 taxes, if you are considered self-employed or independent contractor as it relates to agriculture. Businesses must meet SBA size standards, and the rule of thumb that they are utilizing for PPP is you have to have an FTE count of below 500. However, there are some exceptions to this that we'll talk about. Now, the PPP loan is going to be made available through lenders that are approved to service SBA loans and programs. The maximum loan amount is the lesser of $10 million or 250% of your average monthly payroll cost for 2019. We will talk about how you have to figure out if I don't have payroll and I'm self-employed or sole proprietor in a few slides. The term or maturity of the loan is 2 years from the point of forgiveness determination. We'll talk about that also later on in the slide deck. The legislation states that the interest rate is not to exceed 4%, but in the guidance that has been provided, the rules, they have made comments on and have chosen to actually provide an interest rate of 1% for that 2-year period. It's interesting to note that also within the legislation, it actually has a maximum loan term not to exceed 10 years. But in the rules or guidance, they have made the decision to limit it to 2 years. Also, we have actually been seeing some interest rates through banks as low as 0.5%. So who is actually eligible? Businesses that employ 500 or fewer employees, some exceptions to this, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The PPP loan program is there to cover small business concerns. That is old SBA language. The legislation has expanded upon that to allow business concerns, which means any business concern. So 501c3 nonprofits are eligible, veterans organizations, tribal businesses, and so tribes and nations are eligible as long as they meet some other very specific criteria. Self-employed and independent contractors, any business within specific industries and meets applicable SBA size standards for that industry, even if it employs more than 500 as an FTE count. Businesses with a North American industry classification that we usually refer to as the NICS code that begins with 72, and that includes lodging and restaurants. Who is not eligible? Anyone engaged in a federally illegal activity. Now, what that means is, even though there's many businesses and farms raising marijuana in states that have legalized it, it still remains illegal at the federal level and classified as a class 1 narcotic. All of those businesses and farms are not eligible for the PPP. Anybody that is considered a household employer, including those that have nannies, housekeepers, etc. Any business that has a 20% or more equity stake that is owned by somebody that is presently incarcerated, that is presently on probation or parole, that has been indicted or has been convicted of a felony crime within the last 5 years is not eligible. A business that is owned or controlled by somebody that has received a direct or guaranteed loan from SBA or any other federal agency that is currently delinquent or has defaulted within the last 7 years and has caused that agency a loss is not eligible for this loan. And that is a very important bullet, because we have presently a number of farms that are delinquent in FSA loans, and that may make them or will make them ineligible for a PPP loan. Now, the maximum loan amount determination, who makes that decision? How is it made? It is written into guidance or rules that have been developed through the legislation. Startups not operating prior to 2020 will have to look at their average monthly payroll cost between January 1, 2020 and February 29, 2020. And then a calculation is used to determine what the maximum potential loan value is. Seasonal employers will use the 12-week period beginning on February 15, 2019, or they may choose to use a 12-week period beginning March 1, ending on June 30th of 2019 to determine what their average payroll amount was, average monthly payroll amount was during that period in time. Self-employed with no employees will use their 2019 tax return information. And this comes from the guidance or rules that were developed or made public about 72 hours prior to us recording this. They will use line 31 on the Schedule C of Form 1040, the net profit amount. The equivalent line on a 1040-F is line 34, okay? If the value in those lines is 0 or less, you are ineligible for a PPP loan, okay? If the amount in line 31 of Schedule C or 34 of 1040-F is above $100,000, you have to remove anything in excess of that amount, and you will utilize $100,000 for the remainder of the equation. And essentially that equation is $100,000 divided by 12 multiplied by 2.5. That will determine what your maximum allowable loan amount for PPP is. Now, if you also were eligible for EIDL and used EIDL prior to applying for PPP, there are additional steps that you have to use, and we will show you more specifics on the equation, etc., later on, and that will be done by Mr. J.C. Hobbs. Now, some self-employed issues. Because of the equation that is used for the self-employed individuals, specifically with no other employees, it will make it all but impossible to have the entire loan amount forgiven if you use the maximum loan value that is allowed. And the simple reason for this is 75% of the loan amount for it to be forgiven has to go towards the use of payroll and or self-employed earnings compensation for that 8-week coverage period. So when I take out a loan, I have essentially 8 weeks from when I receive the loan value. Okay, I have 8 weeks to spend that money on approved purposes. And 75% of that has to go to payroll purposes or self-employed earnings compensation. No more than 25% of that loan value can exceed other purposes. And that is the rules for it to be forgiven. Well, because of the calculation that is used, if I maxed out at the $100,000 level, that means the equation that I am going to use is that 100,000 divided by 52 weeks multiplied by 8 weeks gives me a maximum value that I can use for self-employed compensation of $15,385. And again, the calculations we'll go through more specifically, but what this means is my net profit for $100,000 gives me a maximum loan value of $20,833. My maximum compensation is capped at $15,385. If I was to use 100% of the $20,833, that means that my compensation is only at 73.8% of the total loan value. The remaining value that I have expended goes beyond the 25% allowed for other purposes, other approved purposes. That means there's going to be a portion of that PPP loan that will not be forgiven. Okay? Should I worry about that? Probably not, because it is a 2-year maturity on that loan at 1% interest. And so it's not a bad deal when I'm looking at it from that standpoint. If I have a farm and for businesses with employees, how do I figure this out? I have to come up with what my payroll cost is, but it gets a little bit more complicated. So my payroll is going to be salaries, wages, any commissions or anything similar, any cash tips or equivalent, any employer paid vacation, parental, family, medical, or sick team paid for by the employer. If I had to dismiss or separate somebody from the business and I provided compensation package, it's going to include that dollar value. Any group healthcare coverage, insurance premiums, and retirement. It's going to include that. If the employer is required to pay state and local taxes on compensation made to an employee, it includes that in that gross payroll. What it does not include is compensation to an individual in excess of $100,000. So what that means is when I go to figure out my equation, if I have somebody that makes $150,000, I have to remove $50,000 and it is simply plugged in at $100,000. And that is going to be used to figure out my monthly average payroll cost. It does not include the employer's share of withholding taxes or RRB Act taxes. It only includes the employee share, not the employer share. It does not include any compensation to those whose principal residence is outside of the U.S. So this is where we get into the H-2A, H-2B question. And we do not have good guidance. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. This also does not include any costs associated with me having to provide payments for sick leave or the family leave portions under the Families First Act. Again, it also does not provide for any costs associated with the leave, wages for which credit is allowed under Section 7001, 7003 of the Families First Act. Because I am receiving reimbursement through the methods allowed by holding back on the dollar for dollar employer share of FICA or making use of Form 7200 for the advance on the refundable tax credit. So what employees have to be counted to determine my maximum loan amount? This is going to include all full-time, part-time, and other basis variable hour folks. Does not include independent contractors. There are specific calculations for those that use seasonal workers. Now the H-2A and H-2B. Due to this idea of residence, the SBA is essentially saying, don't count them. Because of that terminology that is presently being used, many banks are saying you're not allowed to count them. However, there is nothing in any specific in the legislation nor in any of the guidance that specifically states that guest workers H-2A, H-2B are not to be counted. It just refers to principal place of residence outside of the U.S. Since we have many farms that utilize H-2A and other businesses for H-2B who may have these folks on hand, or they may be in this country for 10 months or more than 6 months, they are spending more time here in the U.S. than they are in their quote-unquote home country. Due to other IRC or IRS code, there is an equation that is used dealing with a 180-day rule that will treat them for tax purposes as a resident that essentially shows that when they file their taxes, that they are being treated as a U.S. resident. They are also being utilized in counts for other purposes and other legislation. So those are the arguments that are being made that say to many folks that indicate, no, they should be eligible for this. And that the interpretation of this is any U.S. companies that have employees that are housed, based, and working in other countries outside of the U.S. Are to be removed from payroll. So we are presently waiting on further guidance with regards to this to confirm one way or the other. PPP provides covered loans during a covered period, and that covered period is typically going to be the 8 weeks following the receipt of the loan value into the borrower's hands. That allows you to spend money for the 8-week portion following that on approved purposes. It is only to be used for expenses that are considered eligible. And if you want this to be forgiven, 75% of the loan value is required to cover payroll and or the self-employed compensation. Must be used to cover the cost of the payroll. It does not include many benefits, but not count. Does not cover the employer portion. Payroll, it should not cover the employer portion of FICA. It will cover utilities for that 8-week period. It can cover rent and lease for that 8-week period. It can cover interest on other loans that were already obligated prior to or by February 15th of 2020. This would include land and personal property. It does not include principal payments, only the interest on loans such as land and for personal property, machinery, equipment, or even a vehicle used for the business. So again, maximum loan amount plus any accrued interest has the potential to be forgiven. 75% of the total loan amount must have been used to cover payroll and or self-employed owner compensation. You are reduced to 25% or less on those other approved expenses. The loan portion that is forgiven will be reduced by any reduction that you have in total salary or wages of any employee. Okay, so if I reduce the head count and I do not bring it up by June 30th of 2020, I do not, in essence, eliminate that reduction, then there's going to be a potential reduction in the amount forgiven of that particular loan. So I may have had to reduce my workforce or reduce wages between February 15th and April 26th. And as long as I return the wage amount / salary and my head count by June 30th, I'm okay. I may still have the availability potentially, as long as I meet all other criteria, to have the total loan amount forgiven. Unresolved questions, issues, and challenges. What if I employ the H-2A or H-2B workers? And as been stated earlier, we're waiting on further guidance. And how you want to play this out when I apply for the PPP loan is going to be based on your risk adversity. If my risk tolerance is very, very low, I'm going to do the CYA standpoint, and I am not going to count them in the payroll for fear of what is the potential ramifications that if I do take out the loan with those numbers in there and guidance comes out, and when we don't know how they're going to say that if this did slide through, what the ramifications are. We just don't know. If you're willing to roll the dice because you're willing to take that stress on your shoulders, go for it. It's going to be left up to you. Okay? So, independent contractor, self-employed, yes, they're eligible. However, questions still need to be answered on how to handle if somebody is in partnerships, has additional businesses that are a sole proprietor or other business partnerships, on whether or not we can receive PPP from these other partnerships and or other entities that I have that I am the sole proprietor. I have no other employees. The reality is right now, what we do know, one loan per person. That is it. So then we have issues of, if I am an equity stake in a partnership with a brother and child or nephew or unrelated party, and that partnership is allowed to take out a PPP loan, because it has to be done at the partnership level, whether or not, if I am also farming on my own, can I also apply for a PPP loan? In many indications, we believe you should be able to, but we just really don't know. So partnerships, each partner does not apply for the loan on their own for the partnership that they have. The entity must file for the PPP. We do not know what the maximum net profit level is going to be used at. Are we going to be held to the $100,000 like if I was a sole proprietor, self-employed individual with no employees, or if they're going to expand that to be $100,000 per partner? We also don't know really how guaranteed payments are going to be handled. If they come out and say, or further guidance is enacted or provided that says $100,000 maximum or $100,000 per person, and you are not allowed to run through anything else, then we know that it doesn't matter that you were able to deal with the guaranteed payment. That guaranteed payment's not coming back into play, and so that gets lost. We don't know what the forgiveness process really looks like right now. We are waiting to get that rule set. We don't know when that's going to come out. We are seeing other bank issues reaching their specific lending limits, not being able to lend any further until feds purchase out their loans. There still is software issues with some banks in the SBA. Different banks are just flat out asking for different information and have different applications, which is creating additional confusions. And now with the guidance that came out 72 hours prior to the recording of this, some banks stopped accepting farms that utilize 1040-F when filing their taxes because they took a literal translation to those rules. Many of us do not believe that was the intent They were just showing here is the number to be used, and that we believe we ought to be using the equivalent on other forms, such as the 1040F. SBA continues to have issues at various levels with incorrectly stating who is eligible, who is not, based on income, size, sending farmers to FSA versus who was eligible using the PPP. Now, the big question, which as of this morning of the recording of this report, which is what if the program or bank runs out of money? We have, in fact, as of this morning, and more likely late yesterday, the monies that were allocated for the PPP and EIDL loans have now, in fact, run out of money. We fully expect that money, based on what many senators and congressmen are saying from both sides of the aisles, there will be money reappropriated. The big question is on when. So right now, my recommendation is for those that were in process is to now sit back, take a deep breath. Hopefully more guidance and rules will be provided prior to the next appropriations for this. And we will know more, and hopefully it will benefit us in the end, but still be preparing. And as you will find out after Mr. J.C. Hobbs speaks, there is a lot of interplay between PPP and EIDL, and that is one of the things that we know some folks want to fix, and Mr. J.C. Hobbs will speak more on this. They want to fix some of these issues which may create additional interplay between PPP, EIDL, as well as those employers that have employees and have to follow some of those Families First requirements on leave. You need to do the math to determine some of these things. So, final words before I hand this off. Much is yet to be determined from a lack of guidance in many areas. Keep watching. There are many links we've provided at the end of the slide deck that you can click on. Here at Clemson, we've developed a COVID resource page with articles we are developing, as well as direct links to various pieces of guidance, frequently asked questions through DOL, through the Department of Treasury, etc. Please keep up on this. We have contact individuals at the end of the slide deck. We are open for you all to give us a call or send your clientele, stakeholders, farmers, ranchers, and others to contact as well. Be careful on the decisions that we make. Think of this as you're taking out a 2-year low-interest loan with the hopes of potential forgiveness. Now, yes, we have discussed there are mechanisms that I can increase my net income from my farm or business by decreasing Section 179 depreciation. If I do that, I may not be able to utilize bonus depreciation. That is going to create an additional taxable amount that I'm going to have to pay this year in taxes. Yes, it will increase my net profit, which will increase my maximum loan amount for PPP, but in reality, does the additional taxes I have to pay in this year offset the benefits I can receive from the PPP? And in many cases, it may not. I may end up paying more in taxes than I would be receiving from a benefit for PPP. You need to do the math. Are there any questions?
So Adam, I had a question. What if one of producers goes to their lender and their lender has set a internal limit on the maximum they're providing a loan for, where that is much lower than a producer qualifies for? What would you recommend them do?
That producer is going to have to make a decision on whether or not they actually need the maximum amount. And if they feel that they're in need of the maximum amount, I would start shopping around with other lenders. The SBA actually has a website that is out there that they can click on that will show them the available lenders within their area that can service SBA loans. And that would be my recommendation, as well as other producers that are having problems because they've heard, because some banks have incorrectly interpreted what's allowed, what's not allowed. And so it may be worthwhile to actually shop around.
Thank you.
I got one question about the being delinquent on the Farm Service Agency loans. I mean, what stage are we talking about? Because FSA takes about 6 months to declare you delinquent. So, I mean, if you're behind on your payments, is that delinquent or what?
That is not necessarily specified. And I think you're going to have to be upfront with that, because even though they might be behind and they haven't received the declaration, and then they receive a PPP loan, and if something happens on the backside of it and the delinquency becomes known through the other agencies, there could be worse ramifications from it, especially if they have not paid that back. And then you have to be careful what funds were actually used to pay off the loan or the amount. And things can get very, very tricky. So I would be very leery of doing that, and I would be upfront. But that would be the CYA answer, is if you are behind on it, not knowing exactly how they're going to define delinquency, I would personally not go there.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we hand off to JC?
Adam, can our farmers apply more than once for PPP if they don't get their maximum allowance?
No. See, and that goes back, and that's a good point, because some might be, they've done work with this particular bank and they may feel like they want to keep that relationship and have everything through that one bank. But if there was an internal limit due to one reason or another, and they're not allowing that producer to take the full value that technically, based on equations, they're allowed to get, and I take the loan out from that bank and then go to another bank to try to get the remainder that I'm allowed, based on the direct interpretation within the rules right now, they will not be allowed that second PPP loan, even though they did not previously max out what they would have been allowed. And so for me, they need to make that decision. Can I live with the allowable limit by the bank, or do I go to another bank and make sure that I'm able to max out if that's really what I need to get through the next 8 weeks?
Thank you.
And with that, I'll hand it off to Mr. J.C. Hobbs.
Thank you, Adam. Let's delve into the economic injury and disaster loans, EIDLs. Some things to look at here. With the coming about of this, these were designed for small business. So these are traditional disaster loans as designed for SBA. They were not set up for agriculture, so all small businesses except agriculture in the original legislation under their SBA rules as well. So agriculture, the reason for leaving them out was that they're traditionally served by USDA, FSA disaster programs. So consequently, they felt like being in one, they didn't need to be in the other. And Congress, in their wisdom of doing so, they really weren't trying to limit ag, but that's kind of the way the interpretation came out from all the rules or uses of SBA, et cetera. And then they went in there, greenhouses. Those operations do qualify. They're typically considered small business, even though they are agriculture related. So we got to look at them, the agriculture for qualifications. They do fit in the EIDL as long as a similar relief program from USDA does not exist. And in talking to some staffers, et cetera, we're still trying to get some guidance as to which programs they have to go to FSA for and which programs they can go to SBA for. So without knowing all the pieces of the puzzle, we're still kind of delving into the area. And without the money, with it running out, there's a discussion of trying to readdress these issues before the next round of allocations occur. Now with the EIDL, there was a loan advance up to $10,000 of the loan amount. That advance is to be treated as a grant, not taxable, not to be paid back. It's supposed to be received within 3 days, a very short amount of time. Again, like I said, not required to repay that advance, even if you're later denied the EIDL loan. Now, if an applicant receives the PPP loan and the EIDL, what occurs is the EIDL amount reduces the amount of the PPP loan forgiven. So even though you look at it and say, well, I don't get the free money, EIDL loans are a much higher rate, which we'll talk about. So there's probably not as much harm in that as what we would think. These EIDL loans used to cover costs that can't be covered due to reduced income. Here's a list of about 4. There's a bigger list that we'll talk about in a moment. But employee sick leave, payroll, increased material costs that we've got to pick up, rent, mortgages, other obligations. Now, the way the rules read, it's available until December of 2020. Exact day is state dependent. Some states are closing this effective like middle of December, others around the 20th. Again, we're waiting on additional funds to see what really does happen here. Recipient eligibility, well, we have to be in operation as of the end of January of this year. No more than 500 employees. Individuals operating as sole proprietors, independent contractors do qualify. Co-ops with no more than 500 employees. This is also our small ag cooperatives. Tribal small businesses with no more than 500. There's also, and Adam pointed out, you go to the NAICS classification and you can find out this thing applies to businesses even with a number of employees greater than 500, as long as they fit that classification system. There's the link there that you can go through the many pages of the various industries and businesses to look at whether or not they qualify, even though they have more than 500 employees. Now, the private nonprofit organizations, those being the 501Cs, we think of those as being civic organizations, schools, et cetera, anybody not subject to federal income tax. The 501Ds, those are the schools, 501Es, community hospitals, et cetera. So, I'm sorry, 501Ds are religious with community ownership of assets. And the 501Es are the cooperative hospitals. So they've tried to put together a fairly good list of items and groups that qualify for the EIDL. What about ag enterprises? Well, the CARES Act did not provide any provision that accepted ag enterprises, that being food and fiber production, ranching, livestock production, aquaculture. But the problem is they didn't specifically mention us either. Small ag co-ops were specifically included, as well as greenhouses. But there was also strong evidence that Congress didn't intend to exclude ag enterprises, but we're still fighting to get clarification on that. Now, the terms of an EIDL loan. Maximum of $2 million depending upon the economic injury to the business. Now, those loans are not forgiven. The only amount that you have that's available to you to be or not worried about would be the $10,000. That grant, again, not taxable, doesn't have to be repaid back. So if you get any amount of money, 10,000 of that max, treat it as a grant. Now, interest rates. For small business, the interest rate on an EIDL loan is 3 3/4%. These nonprofit organizations, 2 3/4. There is an automatic 1-year deferral of making payments, but the interest on the loan starts accruing immediately. So when you get the loan, the interest rate takes in place, interest starts accruing, even though you don't have to make the first payment until 1 year later. Maximum term, 30 years. But SBA looks at your financial condition of the business. What happens? Well, SBA can shorten the repayment period and adjust the monthly payment amount accordingly. So even though it's a 30-year loan, or 30-year term, it does not necessarily mean that you're going to have 30 years to repay it. More information, loans of more than $25,000, they have to be secured with collateral. Loans of 200,000 or more must have a personal guarantee. However, the CARES Act does waive that personal guarantee requirements of any loan less than 200,000. So those loans terms pretty well spelled out. You get an idea of what's going on. Allowed uses of the EIDL. Pretty extensive list. Like I said earlier, sick leave, payroll, accounts payable. So if you've got debts, accounts unpaid, you can use it for that. Operating expenses, materials, rent, fixed debts, but remember mortgage interest and other interest payments, not a principal payment. You can't use it for prepayments, only mortgage interest and operating or business interest payments. Other obligations, there's can be quite a list there as well. Basically has to be related to the business operations as an obligation of that business, then they are allowed to use the EIDL funds for that. Disallowed uses, well, if you want to grow your business, no. Business expansion is not allowed, even with the low interest rates would kind of make that impressive or favorable option. No business expansion. Can't pay cash dividends or bonuses. You can't pay officers and owners of the business unless that pay is coming directly to services performed. Now we can apply for both the EIDL and the PPP. However, the loan funds that you receive cannot be used for the same purpose. You also need to document the uses of the funds from each loan. One of the things that's often discussed about coming from some of the lenders is open up a separate bank account. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but basically that allows you to easily keep track of the fund disbursements, what's going on and where it was spent from the loans so that you don't commingle that with other dollars and consequently cause yourself some grief at a later point. If we're using the EIDL for payroll, well, then the PPP loan proceeds must then be used to refinance the EIDL amount used for that payroll. So you end up, what happens is, chance of that being forgiven from a PPP loan, well, instead of paying 3 3/4%, you refinance that, you pay it at 1%. So again, a definite benefit, but you want to really think about EIDL being used for payroll expenses, then applying for a PPP loan. They'll have some bad effects, I guess is a good way of putting it, kind of one offsetting the other. Now, EIDL advances, they reduce the amount forgiven. So there's some planning you really got to think about. One of the pieces here is accept a PPP first, then consider a need for an EIDL. Now the EIDL application comes through SBA. That is open till 6/30 of 2020. The PPP loan, that comes through a lender. Those are open until 12/2020, as long as until funds run out. That applies to both. The EIDL application here, I've given you the website. That's also included in our references later. So here's some interest rates to look at. Some things I wanted to kind of compare. It may kind of spin the where you want to get your emergency loans, other things coming from. So the Paycheck Protection Program, the pay interest rate on that for the non-payroll portion, non-exempted portion is 1%. The EIDL loan starts out at 3 3/4. Farm Service Agency loans, operating loan, micro loans, those are both below the EIDL amount. So you may want to consider, if you're needing the money for operations, instead of borrowing an EIDL, go to the operating loans or go to the micro loans. Now, keep in mind, an operating loan, it has a $400,000 max. Micro loan has a $50,000 for operating, $50,000 for farm ownership. Combining those two, it maxes out at $100,000. But you're still going to be below the interest rate of an EIDL. Consequently, it may make it beneficial to seriously consider going to FSA before you even can broach the applying for an EIDL loan. Small Business Administration, their emergency loans, they max out at 4%. So that kind of gives you an idea of maybe ways to think about or consider other options versus from going to EIDL, Farm Service Agency, and payroll in the Paycheck protection. Now here's a couple of examples. So the next 4 slides, we're going to look at 2 examples or 2 pieces. The first one, we've got a sample farm here that has no employees. We're going to walk through the calculations that Adam alluded to up front, where we have 2019 net farm income. I went ahead and pushed this to over 100,000. Most of our farmers, and this is what's creating a big stir in DC, a lot of farm operations have very little, even zero net farm income because they utilize depreciation, 179, bonus rules, etc., to wipe out their farm income and not pay self-employment tax. So it's always usually very low. But in this example, I pushed it to the 120,000. The maximum allowable for the PPP is 100,000. So the maximum loan amount, take that 100,000 divided by 12 months times 2.5% or 2.5 rather, so 2.5 times that gives us a maximum loan amount of $20,833. Farmer in this scenario is going to use 75% for his own compensation for 8 weeks. So we look at the 100,000 divided by 52 weeks, multiply it by 8 for the amount of weeks that he's going to get or use that money for as compensation. Therefore, he's got $15,385. That's the amount that's going to be forgiven, 75%. Then the total spent on allowed non-payroll expenses, $15,385, divide that by 75%, that gives us $20,513. Remember that $20,513? Then we have to subtract the $15,385. There's the amount that we're allowed to use for these other items, the rent, utilities, etc. What happens if we're not used? And this would roll into a loan and not be forgiven. If used for the approved expenses, portions of that will be forgiven, or may be. If the farmer then may, like I said, may use no more than $15,385 for his own compensation, if that amount is not spent on his compensation, then the loan amount forgiven is reduced. And no matter what you do, if you go through all the calculations, the loan amount repaid comes in at $321. So no matter what you do, not 100% of that's going to be forgiven. You're going to have some that you're going to have to pay back. But out of the $20,833 you get, repaying $321 at 1%, I mean, you're not talking a great sum of money. In this next example, I've got a farm with employees. He has 2 employees, plus he pays owner compensation. Again, I pushed an amount above the 120,000 for his net farm income. We're only allowed to use 100,000 for owner compensation. For the 2 employees, a little unrealistic, but again, I wanted to make a point that A is being paid 110,000, but the max is 100. So we only get to use 100,000 of his compensation. B is paid a total of $70,000 for compensation. That's wages plus all the other fringes that go along with it. So the total compensation for the farm, 100,000 for the operator, $100,000 for employee A, 70,000 for employee B. So our total compensation is 270,000. Again, take that for the maximum loan, divide it by 12, multiply by 2.5. The maximum loan amount, $56,250. Now the total compensation, again for the 8-week period, the 270 divided by 52 weeks out of the year, by 8 weeks, that's allowed to be used. We get $41,538. So the total spent on allowed non-payroll expenses, $41,538 divided by 75, $55,385. Now you subtract off compensation portion. $13,847 is what he is allowed again to use for the rents, utilities, etc. He can use no more than the $41,538 for compensation and payroll. If he doesn't spend that, just like before, so he doesn't spend the $41,538 on that compensation and wages, then the forgivable amount gets dropped by that that's not spent on those. The loan amount that has to be repaid $856. So again, if you consider the amount that he's received and amount that he has to repay, he's still done quite well. And again, it's at 1%. So really what you've got is a benefit that for the most part doesn't seem to be too painful. Before I go to this slide, there's one thing that we, in the discussion today that we talked about earlier, and Adam made, I believe, made the point. We're using Farm Schedule F. Well, these farms also have income from those enterprises that do not come up and be shown on the Schedule F, and that being cold cow sales. Those animals are treated as capital gain items, like machinery and equipment that's traded in, short-term capital gain, long-term capital gain, depreciation recapture, all shows up on 4797, but it never makes it back to the Schedule F. One of the questions that came up, and hopefully this will get resolved before the next round of payments or monies become available, is the ability for farmers to use more than just Schedule F, actually use income reported on the 4797, which is essentially income generated from sales of assets on the farm to raise up the farm income amount. Now, if a farmer receives the EIDL loan in addition to the PPP, what happens? Well, we can refinance the EIDL if it was, that loan was made between January 31st, essentially February 1 to April 2nd. The term on that amount that's refinanced is reset to 2 years. But again, you've got to look at the next portion. So if it's used for payroll expenses, you get a lower interest rate, 1% versus the 3.75 on the amount that was refinanced, even though it's a shorter term. Proceeds from that advance of the 10,000 EIDL, it gets deducted again from the loan forgiveness amount of the PPP. However, like I said, you're looking at 1% interest on that, not the 3.75. So it doesn't really have a major adverse impact. Well, as I mentioned earlier, keep darn good records. You don't want any question concerning how those monies were used for if you're trying to make sure that it's at the low rate, maximum amounts forgiven, maximum amounts not have to be repaid back, etc. So use a separate bank account. A lot of the banks that I've talked to recently are urging those that get the PPP loan to set up an account outside of their normal business to keep track of those items that they spend the PPP money for, so that when it comes that you have to report that, all you have to do is show them the bank statement and the information that was contained there. You've got to be sure to spend the proceeds on approved items, payroll, utilities, rent, covered mortgage interest, those being business-related loans. Here's some references. These references kind of look primarily at the EIDL in the Payroll Protection Program. I believe these are also at the back, but I went ahead and put them here just in case you needed to know what was going on. A little quicker, easier to find them. So with that, turn it back over to Adam and the group, and we'll discuss questions, etc.
First $10,000, that's basically a grant from EIDL. Does that have to be spent on those items as well? The same things that EIDL's meant to be spent for, or can it be used just for anything?
You've got to use it for the same requirements of the EIDL program.
So if you don't use it for those same things, they can come back and ask for it back?
Well, it sounds to me like they could come back and ask for it. It's supposed to be forgiven, but I'm pretty sure you want to use it on those items just in case.
Well, thank you for spending your time with us as you view this, and I certainly want to thank our experts, Adam, JC, and Derek, as they've shared this information with us. You've got all the slides set. Certainly, here's their contact information for questions, for other comments, and thank you again for your time. We certainly hope this was helpful to you, and best wishes to all of you.